Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar organized by ECGI, the S.C. Johnson College of Business at Cornell University, and the Access Forum. My name is Anastasia Pappas, and I'm the founder and director of the Access Forum. Today's webinar highlights the critical importance of the upcoming COP29 in delivering concrete, actionable plans to address climate change. Because despite global efforts such as the Paris Agreement and carbon pricing initiatives, emissions continue to rise. And as we will hear today, there is still a vast gap between the current carbon pricing at $4 per ton of CO2, and this is only on 24% of global emissions, and the estimated social cost of carbon at $180 per ton of CO2. Therefore, transformative action in climate finance and policy is imperative at this point. So I'm delighted to introduce today Alissa Kleinnijenhuis and Patrick Bolton, who will discuss corporate governance implications of financial strategies for decarbonizing the global power sector. Their presentation is based on a recent paper of theirs titled "The Economic Case for Climate Finance at Scale" and their other recent research. Alissa is a visiting assistant professor at Cornell University, and Patrick is professor of finance and economics at the Imperial College London. The presentation will be followed by what promises to be a thought-provoking panel discussion with Franklin Allen, who is a professor of finance and economics at the Imperial College Business School, Nuno Fernandes, who is professor of finance at the IESE Business School, and Alexander Wagner, who is professor of finance at the University of Zurich. After the discussion, the audience will have the chance to ask questions by using the Q&A function. But without further ado, the floor is yours, Alissa.
Thank you so much, Anastasia, for your very kind introduction. And also thank you so much to the ECGI for hosting us together with the EAccess Forum and also Cornell University. And finally, I would already very much like to thank the discussants today and the panelists, Alexander, Nuno, and Franklin. Thank you so much for joining us. I will be leading this presentation today. Patrick has, I think, a bit of troubles logging in, but hopefully he'll be here soon as well. So I will bring him in at various points of the presentation so he can add his remarks, and he will be a full-time participant in the panel discussion. So what my plan is today is to talk to you about our paper, The Economic Case for Climate Finance at Scale, foremost, but also I will touch a bit on our new work on climate finance to decarbonize the power sector. And we will spend most of the time in discussion focusing on sort of the governance aspects of this, whereas in my presentation I'll focus a bit more on the finance, but hopefully by the end of this webinar we'll have covered both. So let me start off with a bit of an introduction that I also gave earlier this week at CPR for those who were there as well. So why do we care in the first place? Well, what we've seen very recently is that climate change is already starting to intensify a lot in 2024. Just a few weeks ago, we had Hurricane Helene hit the US and also Hurricane Milton. And the damages that these hurricanes have brought about are really large. So by science, they are estimated to be 250 billion for Helene and 50 billion for Hurricane Milton. And of course, we have just seen also in Europe another disastrous flash flooding event where more than a year's worth of rain fell within a matter of a day, causing many deaths in Valencia and also huge economic destruction. I've just looked up whether economic estimates of the damages are already available for this event. It's not yet the case. So why am I pointing this out? Because if you just tally these two losses alone of just two hurricanes of 300 billion, that's already much larger than the climate finance that developed countries are currently willing to commit to emerging and developing market economies, which is currently 100 billion a year. So where I will go with my argument is basically trying to argue and with empirical results that if we are not willing to bring on board emerging and developing market economies for the global green transition, the climate damages that we will experience in the West will only escalate. And currently, probably with Valencia included, we're maybe at 400 billion, and it's gonna get worse if we allow climate change to progress. So there was a powerful article in the New York Times just a few weeks ago on October 7th saying there is no safe climate haven. So North Carolina, where Hurricane Milton or Helene fell, was long thought to be relatively isolated from climate change. And yet it was an area that suffered over 250 billion of losses. So on the current pathway, we're not at all going in the right direction. We just saw a report being published by the United Nations called the Emission Gap Report of 2024, which estimated on current trajectories, we are headed towards 3.1 degree of global warming by the end of the century. And at the same time, we are seeing that the remaining carbon budget to stay within 1.5 degrees is being fast depleted and currently only stands at 200 gigatons for 1.5 degrees, which is about 5 years of emissions at the current rate of emission levels. And actually, I checked it just a few days ago. The carbon budget is even less now than 200, it's 199. So it would be very tempting to think that we can just, go beyond 1.5 degrees because it's so hard to do this in time. But the problem is that if we exceed 1.5 degrees, we are running into really big climate risks of even larger economic damages than we are experiencing today. But more worryingly, we might cross what is called climate tipping points, where essentially once you cross that threshold, climate risks might amplify in a non-linear way in a way that is often irreversible. So for example, there is now quite a lot of evidence that the Atlantic Meridian ocean circulation is becoming very unstable. And if it were to collapse, it would overnight cause a complete shift of the Northern Hemisphere climate, and it may cause other tipping points to be crossed too. So some, think that, okay, well, it's indeed risky to, have too high temperatures, but maybe we can temporarily overshoot and get back to 1.5 degrees. And we saw an article being published in Nature just recently on October 9th, basically pointing out that overshooting temporarily beyond 1.5 degrees is also really risky, for the reason that it temporarily will increase climate damages, it will increase the risk of tipping points, and moreover, it relies on the idea that you might be able to deploy carbon capture and storage at scale, which is currently not a proven technology at scale. The biggest carbon capture and storage plant is Orca in Ireland, which sucks 2 seconds worth of carbon out of the atmosphere, and moreover, carbon capture and storage is not economically viable right now. So relying on carbon capture and storage, an unproven technology, to try to get back once we've overshot is really, really dangerous. So in essence, where we stand today is that we agreed on the Paris Agreement in 2015, which was a landmark agreement. But emissions globally are still on the rise. In 2023, we hit a new record of greenhouse gas emissions of 57.1. We reached an all-time high of CO2 emissions of 37.4. And it's really important to realize, as this plot shows, that all those emissions are primarily driven by fossil fuels. So out of the 42, 37.4 of CO2 come from fossil fuels. So Al Gore very succinctly said, the climate crisis is a fossil fuel crisis. So if we want to resolve the climate crisis, and this is what we will talk about today, we need to focus on financing the early phase out of fossil fuels and its replacement with renewables. The final thing to note is that even though the West has started to decarbonize, I think the EU managed to attain 8% emission reductions this year relative to the last. The US, I think, has about 1% emission reduction. And this is indeed what you see in the blue, which is the United States, and the red charts that their emissions are coming down. But any of their emission reductions are more than offset by growing emissions in emerging and developing market economies like China, India, and other OECD countries. So we, of course, know that climate change is a global phenomena. And in order to halt climate change, we need to be net zero globally. So even if the West would be able to be net zero tomorrow, we will still be headed for climate disaster if we cannot bring emerging and developing market economies on board, where most of the emissions in the 21st century are projected to emerge from. So the big question is essentially, right, we are still on this rising path of emissions. How can we get to net zero in time at speed and scale to try to stick to that 1.5 degree physical limit or close? So one of the ways, there are essentially at least 4 main ways in which this has been envisioned that this can be done. 1, with carbon taxation, 2, with financial markets, 3, with regulation and mandates, and 4, with climate subsidies. So for a long time, carbon taxation was sort of argued as the first best policy to get to net zero in time, but we know that despite over 30 years of efforts, we are still living in a world of incomplete carbon taxation, where only 24% of greenhouse gases are priced, and not in all regions. And the average carbon price is way below reasonable estimates of the social cost of carbon. So what we see here is the carbon barometer developed by Bob Litterman, and he estimates that globally, the average carbon price is around $4 per ton of CO2, once you take into account also the 7 trillion of fossil fuel subsidies. So in this world of incomplete carbon taxation, the question is essentially, can somehow finance plug the gap? And there are 2 papers, at least in the finance literature, that have been published on this, one by Franklin Allen, who's here in the room, and also one by Lasse Heyer-Petersen. And their answer is essentially that there is a complementary role for finance, but the question is whether it can fully plug that gap. So for example, Lasse Heyer-Petersen shows that in order for the cost of capital differentials between brown and green firms, which he defines as green finance, to be able to replicate a carbon tax of $180 per ton of CO2, which is the current Biden administration social cost of carbon estimate, the carbon premium would have to rise to about 18 basis points, which he deems to be quite unrealistic. And moreover, cost of capital differentials cannot deal with the need for early asset stranding of fossil fuels, which is very necessary to stay within the carbon budget. So higher cost of financing for brown firms essentially do not prohibit the continuation of, let's say, a coal-fired power plant that does not need new financing. And with a carbon tax would be forced to close down early because it has to pay for its emissions. But with more expensive financing capital costs, it can in principle continue to run to the end of its lifetime. So this is why Martin Wolf wrote an article in the Financial Times saying financial market forces are not enough to by themselves alone halt climate change. So we need other complementary policies. So one would be regulations and mandates. That's a powerful way to decrease emissions. For example, the EU has a mandate planned for prohibiting the sale of fossil fuel cars after 2035. And so this science paper that was published on this 22nd of August of this summer basically says that that they looked at all the big climate policies over the last 2 decades, and they found that it's not only regulations and mandates, but it's usually these policy complementarities that we're able to collectively bring about gigaton emission reductions. So then we get to the fourth policy, which is essentially subsidies to decarbonize. And these have been relatively successful in the developed countries. For example, we've had the Green Deal in Europe and the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, which have been successful in bringing about decarbonization as we are observing today in these regions. However, subsidization to basically incentivize the build-out of renewables has not been deployed across borders. So just sort of conceptually speaking, right, like carbon taxation is a way to internalize the externality by making fossil fuels more expensive and as such align incentives with net zero. And subsidies basically make renewables cheaper, again helping to shift the focus towards renewables and also align incentives with net zero. So they achieve sort of the same thing more or less in a different way. So basically, the problem is that thus far, climate policy making has been mostly domestically focused. Whereas in principle, the benefits from avoiding 1 ton of CO2 are the same no matter where in the world that 1 ton of CO2 is abated. And it may even be cheaper abroad. So the problem is that even though we are now seeing that renewables are cheaper than ever, this was also mentioned in this Dawn of the Solar Age front cover of The Economist this summer, so far there is not enough investment into renewables in emerging and developing market economies because the cost of capital is so high. So what I will talk about today in my work with Patrick, who is here as well, Patrick, great to have you here, is we've done a study to try to understand whether there's an economic case for developed countries to offer climate financing subsidies, essentially to help to crowd in private capital to decarbonize not just their own regions, but to decarbonize the world. So what we've done in this study is to take a data set of all the coal mines and coal-fired power plants at the asset level. And we essentially asked, what are the costs and what are the benefits of phasing out coal, which is the most polluting fossil fuel? And later I'll talk about power sector fossil fuels more broadly. So we basically say that there are 2 costs at least to consider. One is if you're going to phase out coal, you have to replace it with something else, renewables, to be able to make sure that you keep up with, you meet the demand for energy, because obviously that's a first order concern. You always need to meet the demand. So the first cost is the investment cost in renewables to replace coal and to keep up with any growth in demand, including, for example, driven by AI. And the second cost, we argue, is the opportunity cost to close coal early. So the missed free cash flows to its owners, but also any retraining costs to be able to, and compensation for missed wages to workers to help them find employment elsewhere. And then on the benefit side, we argue that there are at least, again, 2 benefits. One is if we close coal early, we will avoid emissions. And those avoided emissions help to avoid climate damages. So one benefit from phasing out coal early is the avoided climate damages all over the world, including in the West, like the avoided climate damage, let's say, that of avoided hurricanes, and also the avoided adaptation costs. And in addition, it's the avoided air pollution cost that mostly the country itself will no longer suffer, which, for example, in China was a big reason to phase out coal. Importantly, for the investment costs, we're also capturing the complementary investments into the technologies that support renewables, like batteries and grid, which are obviously essential to be able to do the transition. So what we find is that on a global level, the costs of phasing out coal, even if you do it entirely, are far smaller than the benefits of doing so. So, for example, over the horizon up to 2050, the costs are around 23 billion, whereas the benefits under an estimate of the social cost of carbon of $190 per ton of CO2 are 87 trillion, leading to a net benefit of around 63 trillion. And over the shorter horizon up till 2030, the net benefit is around 20 trillion. And what we can see is that the majority of the investment cost needs are in emerging and developing market economies, 16 trillion out of the 23, primarily also in China. So what we've done, so basically what we argue is that, right, like one way to decarbonize is try the Pigovian approach of carbon taxation, where you, through carbon taxation, try to internalize the negative externality. And the other way to decarbonize is sort of the Cogen approach of contracting and bargaining, where essentially you would pay your polluter to stop polluting in the case that it makes you economically better off. So this is exactly Cogen's argument, that paying the polluter to stop polluting is sound economic logic if it makes you better off. And so what we, as I will explain in more detail, show is that climate finance from developed to developing economies is not just an equitable or moral obligation given the West's greater historical wealth and greater emissions, but it's also in their economic interest to do so. So what we've done here is just compare our quantitative estimates against those of other authoritative sources. And first of all, we find that if we aggregate all the plant level data to the global level, we get the same emissions as the International Energy Agency. But also in terms of investment cost needs, we find broadly similar outcomes, with the difference that we are much more granular. So we estimate it at the country level, not just at the regional level. And we split this by opportunity cost and investment cost. And we actually split this by fossil fuel type. The IEA estimates focus on fossil fuels more broadly. So, of course, we know that we don't have a global government. So even though the global net gain is positive of phasing out and replacing coal, what matters is whether it's in the interest of individual countries who are the decision makers. So what we wanted to understand is how are the benefits from phasing out coal distributed across the world? And for that, you can use estimates of the country level social cost of carbon, where we know that the equality holds that if you sum up the country level social cost of carbon, you get the social cost of carbon, let's say of $190 per ton of CO2. So you see here this distribution of the pie chart, and we note, for example, that the USA social cost of carbon is quite high as a share of the world's social cost of carbon, which is in part also due to the fact that they have more wealth. So they have more to lose, which is possibly not fair in the way that these social cost of carbon are estimated. But anyway, so what we do next is we ask, what are the country level benefits of phasing out fossil fuels and replacing it with renewables? And we find that actually in most cases that's negative. And that holds both if the government pays for everything themselves, and also in the case where they're able to let the private sector pay for part of it. So importantly, if we focus on phasing out fossil fuels and phasing in replacement renewables, there's two costs, as I said, the opportunity cost of the investment cost in renewables. So since closing coal early doesn't necessarily generate a profit stream, we argue that governments should simply be paying grants to close that early. Another option would be to sell carbon credits for the avoided emissions, but that is less likely to result in additionality, and it's also not clear that you can sell those carbon credits at a high enough price. And for the phase-in pipeline of the renewables investment costs, because renewables in principle generate a revenue stream, you can try to use the public funds to help to bring down the risk so that the risk-adjusted return exceeds private capital's hurdle rate, and you can bring in the private sector through what is called blended finance. So in the bottom plot, we're showing the case where each government would pay completely for the opportunity cost of coal and 25% of the public cost to crowd in private capital. And even in that case, it's negative. And by the way, just for your information, empirically, we find that the opportunity costs of coal are much smaller than the investment cost in renewables by about 2 magnitudes. So paying to the polluter to stop polluting is really an economic bargain, and paying those grants for them to close is not charity. The Cogen argument is exactly that it's in our economic interest because it makes us economically better off. So what we ask next, okay, so we find that for many countries their net gain is negative. Would it be in the interest of a larger coalition of rich enough financier countries to help pay for their decarbonization? So here we're looking at the developed countries, the advanced countries, and we ask what would be the net gain for advanced countries to pay for the decarbonization of emerging and developing market economies. And so what you see in the bottom plot as an example is if, again, we are able to crowd in private capital to pay for 75% of the investment cost, we see that the net gain for advanced countries of paying even for their complete decarbonization under a conservative global social cost of carbon estimate of $80 per ton of CO2 is 131%. So their benefits minus their costs over their costs are 131% greater than their costs. And for developed countries, that's about 200%. Of course, so we're basically showing that even if developed countries had to pay for the complete transition cost away from coal in emerging and developing market economies, it would be positive for them. But of course, you might argue that these countries should contribute something themselves as well. So what we study is what if the countries in the developed world would pay up to their private benefits and the rich countries only pay the remainder, then the net gain for rich countries is even greater for emerging economies, estimated at 227%. So essentially coming back to this point, right, thus far, developed countries first agreed at COP 15 in 2009 and then taken up as part of the Paris Agreement, have promised to pay $100 billion a year to developing countries to help them decarbonize and also to help with mitigation. And what we will see at this COP29 which was already agreed as part of the Paris Agreement, is that a new common quantified goal of climate finance will be agreed, where it is understood that this political number of 100 billion should be updated to something closer to what these developed countries actually need. And so what we're showing is that if rich countries are not willing at COP29 to commit we can look at the precise numbers, but the trillions essentially needed for them to decarbonize, it's actually not, it makes them lose out, right? So, and you can just concretely think back of these 3 episodes of Valencia, Hurricane Milton and Hurricane Helene. This is just 2024 losses. If the West is not willing to help decarbonize EMDs at scale, that's the important point, because climate change is a scale problem, as Friedman said in Bill Gates' new documentary. Now, so the only way we're gonna really dent climate damages is by acting at scale. So if the rich world is not willing to do that, they're going to settle themselves up with ever higher mitigation and adaptation costs, which are already becoming very, very large, larger than the 100 billion promised. So, of course, what we're showing in this paper is that there is a net economic benefit for the developed countries to help decarbonize EMDs. But you might still say, okay, it's a net benefit, but if they have to pay, can they actually fiscally afford that? And so what we show here is that if you look at the total decarbonization costs, if the West were to pay for all EMDE, excluding China's decarbonization away from coal, let's say over 2024 till 2030, assuming you can crowd in private capital for 75%, we find that it's no more than 0.32% of their GDP, or over the time horizon up to 2050, no more than 0.14% of their cumulative GDP. So rich countries really like to say that they cannot afford it, but of course, but what we show is that it's actually affordable. And if they don't want to tax taxpayers today, they can presumably issue sovereign debt without increasing their sovereign debt burden substantially. So what the idea that we sort of developed originally in our great carbon arbitrage paper has actually been put into practice in embryonic prototype form by what is called just energy transition partnership deals. And these have been deals that broadly follow the blueprint of what we propose. So let's take the deal. So there was one with South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Senegal. So let's take the one with Indonesia as an example. This was a deal where 20 billion was committed, of which half was public funds by a financier coalition of rich countries of the G7, the EU, Norway, and Denmark. And the other half was offered by banks that signed up to the Glasgow Alliance for Net Zero, who paid the other 10 billion. And it was intermediated via development institutions such as the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. And it was a deal aiming to phase out coal early and phase in renewables to replace it, to help bring down Indonesia's 2030 interim NDC target. And it was meant to be a just transition where somehow the opportunity costs are compensated. And so what we indeed argue is that paying these opportunity costs is in our economic interest, but also helps to alleviate political opposition to any transition, right? So what do we think has gone right and wrong about these deals? So we believe that these are actually very promising deals. If you can replicate these at scale with the biggest coal polluters, you can quickly add up to a global deal. There are many other countries that have expressed interest in partaking in these deals, such as Kazakhstan and Colombia. But thus far, these deals have not been offered at the right scale. So Indonesia itself estimates it needs 100 billion essentially up to 2030. Our estimate is that it's about 250 billion. Ours is more larger because we assume a greater emission reduction. So they lack scale. But the other problem is that most of the money has been offered in the form of concessional loans, whereas not enough money has been offered in the form of grants, less than 2%. So Indonesia is facing troubles to phase out its coal early because no one paid for it. So they're trying to go down the carbon credit route, but it's not clear that they can sell that at a high enough price. So essentially, the key point, I guess, that we're arguing is that thus far, finance has been focused on project-based finance or project-based climate finance. These are the first cases of countrywide finance deals, and this is exactly what we propose, that you make a countrywide financing plan of phase out and phase in. But in order to do this successfully, you actually need to properly pay for that phase out and phase in pipeline. And currently, because in Indonesia, not enough grants is given to close coal early and the grid is already oversupplied, Indonesia cannot just add renewables without bringing coal offline. And similarly, you cannot bring online renewables without having sufficient grid payments and renewable storage capacity. So you really need a system-wide plan. And the other thing I guess we would argue is that concessional loans settle these countries with debt. So it would be better if countries really offer the junior equity tranche financing for the renewable phase-in pipeline to be able to crowd in private capital without increasing their debt burden. So in the context of COP29, and then I'll try to quickly sort of wrap up in less than 5 minutes, what are currently the big things that are going to be discussed at COP29? So the last pre-COP meeting was this October 9th, 2024, and essentially it's broadly agreed that any goal would have the following components. There would be an agreement on the quantums of what public and private finance goals should be for developed country decarbonization. So currently, most countries agree that there should be a multi-layered goal, multi-layered quantum, where rich countries would agree on the inner quantum of how much public funding they're willing to commit to EMDEs, and also an outer quantum of how much total private finance plus public finance they want to crowd in, essentially, to commit to EMDEs, to in total help to align financial flows with net zero in line with Article 2C of the Paris Agreement. The other elements under discussion are what is the time frame. So what we would argue based on our work is that the scale has to happen now, right? Don't delay it because we are already very close to 1.5. The other thing that is open for discussion is what's the thematic scope? Is it only mitigation and adaptation finance or also loss and damage? And what are the sources? So what counts as climate finance? And which countries should contribute? Some rich countries argue that wealthier emerging economies should also be contributing. And so what we're essentially saying is that climate finance at scale that is offered by by the public sector should really be grant equivalent. Just only concessional loans is not good enough. And then there are qualitative elements. So this is essentially what I just explained, and it's shown in this graph. So based on our quantitative empirical work, just to phase out coal alone in emerging and developing market economies, we find that for the inner quantum, rich countries should at least commit 100 billion. And again, this is only mitigation finance and only coal. And for the outer quantum, if you focus on the total climate finance, both public and private, it should be around 760 billion per year. So I just want to offer 2 more minutes of one more really important link before I hand the floor to the discussants, which is how the new common quantified goal of climate finance links to the next really big step of policy making, which is that in 2025, it will be the first year since 2020 that countries will be updating their nationally determined contributions. Now, what's the problem? The problem is that the current nationally determined contributions, which essentially encompass each country's climate ambition and committed action, are completely out of whack with the Paris Agreement, not even with the 2-degree goal. So the current unconditional NDCs are 2.8, the conditional NDCs are 2.6. And so if the next 2025 round is not ambitious enough, the next update is 2030, when we will be out of the carbon budget. So most developed countries feel that they cannot implement an ambitious enough NDC in 2025 unless they get enough climate finance support via this new common quantified goal. And so the new work essentially that Patrick and I have done, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, I will just highlight the top level thinking, is on how you can actually both plan for power sector decarbonization and how you can finance that and how you can connect that to the nationally determined contributions that are so absolutely critical for where we have any hope of staying close to 1.5 degrees. And the reason why we focus on the power sector is, as the 2024 emission gap report shows, it's the sector with both the highest emissions in sector-wise from all other sectors, 15 gigatons, but also with the highest mitigation potential. So we already know how to, all the scalable technologies to replace fossil fuels on the power grid are already known. So this report estimates that by 2030 already we're able to, mitigate 12 gigatons out of the 15 in the power sector. And conversely, if we are not going to decarbonize the power sector now, because of the increased demand for energy from AI and so on, the power sector will become an emission bomb, further fueling global warming. So decarbonizing the power sector is absolutely first order. So I'll just mention these 12 steps of how you can go about doing that, and there are lots of results. I'll skip that for now. We can maybe come back to that in the discussion, for how you can tie essentially what I just presented to a detailed NDC plan. So as a country, you would basically say, right, what's my current energy mix? You would try to project your emissions and your demand on their business as usual. You would project how your emissions would need to fall to be aligned with a net zero carbon budget consistent pathway. And given that, you would basically estimate what is the amount of fossil fuel assets that would need to be phased out every year in order to implement that emission reduction pathway, and what are the amount of renewables plus complementary storage technologies and grid to replace coal and keep up with growing demand. So what you can then do is you can essentially create a phase-out pipeline and a phase-in pipeline where you plan which year what assets would come offline and what assets would come online. And you would basically put a price tag on the phase-out and phase-in pipeline. And finally, you would determine a financing plan for how this can be financed. So we've done all of this already empirically for every country in the world. And I guess we would basically give the same prescription as for the economic case for climate finance at scale paper I just presented, which is to say that for the phase-out pipeline, it's often in the economic interest either of the country itself or of financier countries to simply pay grants for closure. Whereas for the phase-in pipeline, you can use some public funds to crowd in private capital to pay for most of it. And so you can essentially make this big idea I just presented connect to NDCs in a very precise way. And Patrick and I have, for example, contributed to the Coalition of Finance Minister flagship report that will come out just before COP29, which hopefully will help countries also implement Paris-aligned, 1.5 degrees aligned decarbonization pathways and know how this can be financed in principle. So I want to thank you so much for your attention. And I'm really, really excited to hear what Alexander, Nuno, and Franklin have to say, and also to converse with Patrick in discussion thereafter.
Thank you, Alissa, very much. This was a very interesting presentation. Before I give the floor to Franklin, Patrick, would you like to add something?
Thank you, Anastasia. I thought maybe I would add a few words about governance, which has not been addressed yet. So, as Alissa pointed out, the funding for renewable energy development will be mostly in the form of what's called blended finance, involving co-investment by a public fund agency, a public funding agency, and then private funding from capital markets. The model for blended finance is one, the most realistic model is one that involves a development bank. So think European Investment Bank, think EBRD, World Bank, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. The simple idea of the model of blended finance is that the funding, the public funding that's brought by the development bank is a first loss fund, and that de-risks the investment for private investors. That's a simple idea, but the de-risking has a governance dimension as well: due diligence, monitoring, selection, governance dimension. When you have a development bank involved, you are bringing not just concession financing, but you're bringing all the institutional advantages of dealing with an investment bank, the types of things that are touted by. Here I have a presentation in front of me that the EBRD, how it pitches the co-investment model is it says it is better placed for access, to give access, better placed in terms of risk mitigation. I've mentioned that, and it has because it is a repeat investor in a region, it has more of an ability to control any disputes that might arise. Let me say a few words about disputes, and then I will conclude also with the recent direction the World Bank is going, saying what the president of the World Bank recently, how he summarized the 5 priority points for financing the energy transition in the EMDEs. As far as dispute resolution is concerned, this is a well-known problem when you're looking at long-term infrastructure investments. So the typical concern is that once you have contracted for, let's say, the construction of a power plant, once the investment is made, these investments are sunk, and then you can have changes forced onto the operator in terms of the kind of prices of electricity that are acceptable. That's a hold-up problem, classical hold-up problem. And the way investors protect themselves against this hold-up problem is by including what's called investor-state dispute settlement clauses or international commercial arbitration clauses into these contracts. And they are providing substantial protection to investors, but they're also quite controversial dispute resolution mechanisms. So there is definitely a role to be played by development banks in making these less controversial procedures. And this can be done by rethinking the types of governance of public-private partnerships, what kind of control rights the development bank has, and how you can also try and get a smoother dispute resolution mechanism. So there's a lot to be done here. Let me now conclude, in the interest of time, by mentioning the 5 priorities that are now being set out by the World Bank under its new leadership for what the World Bank calls the private sector lab. How is it going to scale up and organize public-private partnerships and blended finance arrangements? And so there are really 5 priorities that are really interesting. So a first one, which I thought was rather surprising that the World Bank has already undertaken, is that the World Bank has, with some emerging market countries, has already entered what it calls a regulatory compact with these countries, setting up a regulatory framework for the energy markets, for the energy sector, electricity sector. And then that facilitates, if you want, it de-risks in a way some of these, just through regulation, these energy investments. Then it wants to unify on a single platform all its guarantee programs. That's a second step in the direction of greater efficiency of blended finance. And then a third step, which is particularly interesting and important, is that it now wants to encourage, through the IFC, more equity-like investments for its junior tranche. The main problem being that if you come in as a guarantor, if you come in as a first loss investor, if you're a debt investor, then you're most exposed to losses. Hopefully you won't get those losses, and then you just get paid back principal and interest. But if you're an equity investor, you also exposed on the upside. And if you have sufficient diversification around the world in terms of projects, you can get a much higher and a more reasonable expected return. So that's the direction in which the World Bank wants to go, which is more like a private equity model. And this, I think, is important new direction. Fourth priority is multi-layer risk sharing. And the last priority is to really create an asset class for these development, renewable energy development loans and bonds in emerging markets. That's, of course, the direction you want to go in terms of reaching scale. You really want to have a pipeline. This is where, coming back to what Alissa said, this is why it's important to have a pipeline. There has to be a flow of assets that are being originated, a predictable flow. Once you have that, you will have on the other side institutional investors from all over the world ready to buy these assets, and then you've created a very large market, and that's how you're achieving scale. With that, let me stop what I had to say. Maybe come back with Q&As, but I want to give the full time to our discussants.
Franklin.
Sorry, my froze. Is it my? I should go next,
Yes,
Anastasia.
that's right. I think it was a bit frozen.
Yes. Okay. So let me start. So let me say first of all what an interesting presentation that Alissa and Patrick gave, and how important it is with these huge amounts of potential surpluses that are there. Let me start by adding some of the other aspects of it, which is it's not just money, it's lives. So if we think about Hurricane Helene, it's 230 people dead. Milton, it was fortunately much lower, it was 14. Valencia floods is up to 158, but is rising, probably be significantly above that. But these are small, actually small numbers. So our colleagues at Imperial released a study on the effect of climate change on to 10 worst climate events. And the deaths there are truly staggering. So I won't go through all the 10 that they did, but if we stick to the developed world, the heat wave in Europe in 2023 killed 37,000 people, in excess of that. In 2022, the heat wave in Europe killed more than 53,000 people. But relative to the developing world, there was a cyclone in Myanmar that killed 138,000. And then the worst one was a drought in Somalia that killed over 250,000 people. So these numbers are horrific, and they're going to get worse in all of these kinds of events going forward as we have more and more warming. Now, the problem that I see with all of this is the politics of it. So technically, it works. So the UK got rid of coal at the end of September. We have no more coal-fired power plants in the UK. It's all switched to renewables, and we still have gas and so on, and some nuclear. But it's quite possible to get rid of coal, which it would be great. Now, the problem is that there just isn't much political support for these things. So even in the UK, which has, I think, a fairly good record on climate issues, we originally were going to get rid of fossil fuel cars and trucks and so on in 2030. That's me moved back to 2035. And neither party is really pushing those kinds of things. Now, even in the EU, which is a very small part of the problem, as Alissa alluded to, there's also a lot of pushback in terms of climate change policies. So if you think about when they tried to put heat pumps in, mandate heat pumps in Germany, that was pushed back. So that they didn't, in the end, do that, despite the fact that the government coalition has the Green Party. If you look at the 2035 mandate of banning fossil fuel cars in EU, there's a lot of pushback now because in Europe, the car industry employs huge numbers of people, and electric cars are going to need many fewer people. So there's pushback from that. You could do it with Chinese cars. So BYD has wonderful cars for $10,000, but they're being taxed in the EU and even more in the US. But those are small relative to some of the other problems. So if you think we had Hurricane Helene and Milton, which, as Alissa said, caused enormous amounts of damage. And yet on Tuesday, there's going to be an election in the US, and there's a 50% chance by most people's estimates that the Republicans will win. And the last time that Trump became president, first thing he did was to take the US out of the Paris Climate Agreement. And it's quite likely that that's going to happen again fairly soon after the election if the Republicans win. So that's a big problem because the US is the second biggest emitter. But even if the Democrats win, if you think about the IRA, it's only 369 billion for the domestic subsidies. At least that's my understanding of the number. And under the Democrats, the US is producing more oil and gas than they've ever done before. And again, the politics are such that there's not much support in the developed world for these kinds of policies. There are, I mean, you had that slide with, you know, the Indonesian deal, and there are a few countries that have that desire, but the large ones, by and large, the politics of it is such that there's huge pushback, even in places which we think of as being quite supportive of climate change. So even though there are these potential big gains that you've identified in your work over the years, the political battle we're losing in a big way, because in most developed countries, there isn't a desire to do this. Now, in terms of actually coming up with funds from the public sector, the kinds of numbers that you gave, Alissa, is literally trillions of dollars over the years, but there isn't the support for that in any of these countries, I think, except maybe a few small ones. And that's the real problem, that we're losing the political battle, that there's just no particular desire in the developed world to do these things. And I think that the other issue, which is very important, which is a huge problem, is the problem of corruption. So there's a great reluctance in most developed countries to give large amounts to emerging country because of the problem of corruption. And so, you know, if you think about very few countries actually give the 0.7% to developing countries to help their development. So UK used to, but it got cut back, and it's now much smaller than 0.7%. And part of the reason for that is that people are worried that much of this money that gets transferred to developing countries gets eaten away in corruption and ends up in Switzerland or in various other places in a few people's bank accounts. And I think that's going to be the biggest problem that you face in terms of mobilizing these funds. And I think that's why we haven't got to the 100 billion, for example, that was mandated in the COP, 100 billion a year that was mandated in COP 2009. I mean, interestingly, the country that people are willing to do business with in developing countries is China. So not only are the many developed countries not willing to give money to these countries, because they have all these, those countries, the developing countries, aren't willing to deal with the developed countries because of all the restrictions that the World Bank and the IMF and so on put in place on them. But they are willing to deal with China. So again, I think a very important part of this is what is the role of China. So in Africa, for example, China has more loans and so on than, as I understand, or comparable to the World Bank. And so, but that's because they turn a blind eye to corruption and deal with it somewhat differently. But I think those are the issues that are really the problem ones in terms of the plan. You know, I fully agree, there are these huge benefits in terms of the money and in terms of lives saved and so on. But the problem is the politics and the corruption. And those, I think, are things that you will have to address to start persuading people that this is going to be a viable plan. Let me stop there, sorry. Thank you.
Anastasia,
So
am I allowed to say one sentence in response, and then we can discuss the rest in the discussion?
Sure.
And Patrick, feel free to chip in. I guess I cannot disagree with you at all, Frank, and I think you put, you highlighted two really important points: politics and corruption. I'm not saying that our proposal overcomes all, not at all, but I do think we have thought about these. So, for example, if you think about corruption, right? I was presenting at Bruegel, which is an leading EU think tank with the EU policymakers have been doing these JETP deals. And they were making a similar type of point, not in the same language, but it came down to the same thing. And so what we basically said is, well, what you can do is you can make any financing conditional on successful implementation. So you would give the financing for a given year, and if the country doesn't successfully use that for decarbonization, it would not get more the next year. So then in that way, you still, there's no excuse for countries not to, in principle, commit money at scale, but you chop it up such that it's only being dispersed conditional on performance. That would be one way to try to deal with it. That may not overcome all problems. Then on the politics side, I fully agree that that's difficult, right? But I think one of the really important reasons why we're saying that you must pay for the opportunity cost of coal is in order to make it much more politically palatable to do the transition. Because what we're essentially empirically estimating and arguing is that you should pay those that are left behind at least as much as they would have earned on their business as usual. So just to give one example, in Germany, the government had subsidies to phase in renewables early, and then it had an auction to phase out coal capacity early. And actually, coal companies ended up voluntarily partaking because they knew that the money that they would get from that auction was higher than what they would get under their best predictions of business as usual. Of course, because of the Ukraine crisis, briefly, some of these coal plants were opened up again, but as far as I know, the government is back on track with its schedule. So, and likewise, if you think of West Virginia and the US, if you want them to be on board, you want to compensate that region for what they would lose out on. And this is exactly what we argue. So we're not saying that that will overcome the politics, but what we're saying is if you can align financial incentives with making sure they're not worse off with the transition, that will at least make the politics easier. And then I hope that we can more and more start to convince people in Europe and the US that the current climate damage they are suffering are already magnitudes larger than what they're willing to pay to avoid future suffering by transferring money to developing countries. So if they start to see that that equation of imbalance is starting to become more and more whacked, hopefully that will also alleviate the politics. But again, I fully agree that these are two really important issues. So back to
I won't respond at all because I want to leave time for discussion. So I'm sure we'll discuss some of these issues later on.
So it's a chance to my colleagues make their own presentations, and then there's a lot of food for thought here. So I'm sure there's going to be an interesting discussion afterwards. So Nuno, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anastasia, and thank you very much, Alissa and Patrick, for your great paper and presentation. I think totally agree on the economic side, and I think I'm aligned with Franklin. We see the economic case. I think it's very clear. You show it very clear in your paper. In my presentation and in my discussion, I'm going to focus more on how I see the government's role in a broader picture. Because I don't think when we talk about climate finance, I don't think about subsidies. That's not the first thing that comes to my mind. Okay, so I think we have to have a broader definition and broader impact. At least that's what I'm going to share, some thoughts on a broader impact of governments in the climate finance discussion, which is not just on subsidies. You can see my screen now, correct? Very good. So, I mean, I'm not going to go through this. It's very clear. Topic is more relevant than ever. We have all these dramatic events and very damaging events. It's clear that we need private capital. Okay, public investment is not going to take us very far. Most of the Western governments and most of they simply don't have spare capacity for this. So there may be some public investment, but we need to have private investment for sure. So it's not enough to have public investment. I'm going to share basically a series of ideas that come from my climate finance book. I look at this from many different perspectives, from the corporate finance side to the capital market side. And I finished the book with a chapter on governments and regulation, and that's what I'm going to talk, because that's the theme of today. But I think on the corporate side and on the governance side, which is also the topic of today, we're talking in a very narrow sense of governance, which is global governance. But I think on the governance of this, there will be lots of interesting things. But today we focus on governments and regulations. Clear that we have very global damaging events, okay, and extreme weather events, as Alissa has shown, very damaging ones, and the recent ones, of course, in Valencia and other places, and this ultimately translates into asset valuation, asset destruction, and most of the losses are in the north. Most of the losses are not in the south. Most of the losses of extreme weather events and any kind of forecast of losses in future years because of climate change are concentrated in the north and not in the south. So, of course, there is an economic case coming from this physical risk transmission. Besides that, I think we all understand there is going to be a series of stranded assets once we close certain assets, fossil fuel assets. This will heavily impact those countries that depend a lot on carbon commodities. But besides the physical and transition risks, we also have whole supply chain issues. And so they very quickly reach developed countries, OECD, European Union, US, through capital flows, markets, supply chains, through investment and ownership of companies in capital markets, that's very clear, and through financial institutions, lending value chains. So it's clear that this is not, even though the pollution may be, and I have something to say, maybe now concentrated in the least developed countries, the problems are a lot concentrated in the north. And so what can the government do? I mean, I think besides, I think there are 6 things ultimately. I think one is on the pricing of emissions, the other is on the just transition and political economy issues. On the reporting and climate disclosures, I think there's also a strong role for the government here. As for global regulations, where we need much stronger convergence, I totally agree with Patrick that this is that there is a strong role for multilateral development banks, and there is a role also for central banks. On subsidies, we don't even have to go through this. It's clear there's still a lot of subsidies to fossil fuels globally. So this is something where if you need to free up capital, start with the subsidies. But then it's not so easy to do, right? Because once we think about carbon taxes and now moving to the taxes, even though only 24%, I think that was the number you mentioned, of global emissions are taxed, even that is a total nightmare. It's a mess. Because you have all these different carbon taxes in countries around the world, which are different. They are not the same. We don't have a single uniform carbon tax. We have, when you think about markets, ETS markets, another mess. You have markets at the regional level, at the city level, at the national level, at the region level, and they all have different definitions, and they don't trade, they don't communicate. So it's impossible to have markets where you cannot communicate, and so this is not really helping all these asymmetric carbon prices and carbon trading systems. And here there's a strong role for government coordination that has nothing to do with subsidies. Then another strong role for governments has to do with the just transition. And just transition, sometimes we talk just transition, but when I hear, and particularly in policy-making circles, I think it's much more just transition that European Union and US and North governments, typically they're just saying just transition to China and other less developed countries. I don't think that's serious, right? And if we want to have a proper transition, we cannot have this in the imperative. We have to make things be much sharper. And I'm going to do an analogy with risk management. So in risk management, there are typically 3 steps. One is to be aware of the risks. The other is to assess the risks. And the third is to mitigate and act on those risks. And I think sometimes we're not even at the awareness level for these just transition items, right? And so if we're not aware, we cannot assess, we cannot mitigate. It's very simple to say carbon emissions are created in China. China uses coal, or not just China, but the world uses coal. Let's shut down coal, and this will help emissions. Yes, but then we have to be mindful of the fact that there are whole regions. A coal mine is a huge thing, and so it's a huge thing, and there are whole regions that depend on coal mines. And so eventually we can have totally deserted cities totally deserted regions because of that. This is a photo in the 80s in the UK, a big demonstration in front of when a coal plant in the UK was about to get closed. This is in the 80s. And there was going to be massive demonstrations, and so you see the policemen coming to protect assets and people. But so this is just one coal plant, and it's in the UK. Now, if you think about Poland, just as an example here in Europe, whole regions, whole provinces of Poland depend on coal. And so basically 100% of the population is employed in the coal sector one way or the other. So once you close down coal mines, so what to do, right? It's not trivial, and it has to be given proper thought before even thinking about proceeding further, because it's not just about cash flows for the companies or the owners of the companies, it's about much more than that. So again, raising these three risk management principles: the awareness, assessment, mitigate, and act. And I think sometimes we also live in what I call the "we are the world, we are the children," Stevie Wonder world, in which, I mean, yes, who is polluting? It's non-OECD countries. If you look at the pollution nowadays, it's not coming from the OECD. In the OECD, we barely use coal, we barely use oil, we use mostly gas, nuclear, hydro, and renewables. So who is polluting? Well, who is polluting is the developing countries, and mostly because of coal. And that's true. This is a fact. This is data. This is what's happening today. And it's even more striking when we look at the country-by-country emissions, right? What's the share of CO2 emissions of China? It's almost 1/3 of the world. And the United States, it's half of that. And Europe, where I live, it's 7%. So it's very difficult for many people in Europe to understand what we're doing, because we only pollute 7%, but the rest of the world is 93%. And that's what I mean by the Stevie Wonder world, right? Looking at these pictures and saying something about this is fundamentally flawed, because it's the difference between a flow and a stock. Here, this is the flow, what's happening in the current year, actually in 2018. But what we need to be mindful is the stock. And when we look at the stock, the picture totally changes. And the picture shows that if you aggregate emissions, because the problem is a problem of a stock, is cumulative pollution and CO2 emissions over time. Then who polluted? Well, it was clear it was the United States and the European Union that polluted. It was not China, it was not Japan, Russia, Canada, or India. So the problem definitely was created by us, in the large sense of the developed countries. And now we are asking others to pay a significant part of this price. And I don't think this is reasonable to approach in any negotiating table. And then local versus global. To finish, we all understand the global impacts, and then the local regulations. I already talked about this. And so to summarize, I think there are several investors, several stakeholders that have important global roles. Standard setting bodies on non-financial reporting, that's something where we need much more alignment. Regulators and central banks, stock exchanges, and here there's strong role for governmental policies that have nothing to do with the money, but have to do with clear concepts and definition, have to do with making clear what's green and what's not green, because right now we have what I call 50 shades of green. I mean, there's lots of green definitions and lots of green portfolios and green assets. And so that ultimately gives rise to plenty of greenwashing opportunities at the company level, at the fund manager level, at the asset owners level. And that's not very good, but it's happening, and we have to be clear. But first we have to eliminate some distortions, because it's a substantial risk, for instance, for financial institutions that have brown portfolios while having very nice ESG reports. Sustainability-linked loans, it's very nice, but if you don't use serious and challenging KPIs there, it can be seen as pure greenwashing as well. And so the European Union, for instance, is taking significant steps in this dimension, but it has to be done at a broader scale. And I think here is where the coordination is very important, not just on the taxonomy of activities, but on the labels for funds, indexes, benchmarks, green bond standards, disclosure standards, all of that. So without going going more on this, just finish. I believe also there is a strong role for existing institutions, the multilateral development banks, and I'm going to end here, and maybe we'll leave part of this for the Q&A. I should have said in the beginning, I'm a professor of finance indeed, but I'm also a board member and chairman of the audit committee of the European Investment Bank, and all the things I've said only are my opinions and they don't represent the bank's view on anything. In particular, when I talk now about MDBs, the EIB, and this is all public information, the EIB has labeled itself as the EU Climate Bank. And so has defined a climate bank roadmap for 5 years, ending next year, with different streams. But basically, it's about accelerating the transition and supporting Paris alignment. And with very concrete milestones and objectives. 1 trillion funding in the next decade, well, in the current decade, and the fund and the share of activities that the bank finances to reach more than 50% after next year, 2025. And so these are very important, and this is much more than what the bank was doing in the past. I mean, I can tell you, before this was implemented, the share of, let's say, climate financing was about 25% of the funding of the bank. Now it's about 50%. And also implementing in its evaluation of every project very strong shadow costs of carbon. So right now, the EIB is using much more than $100 per ton when evaluating projects, which of course is going to hurt a lot any project that has carbon emissions, and it's going to make more economic appealing projects that save emissions. So in closing, I think there's a strong role for governments beyond subsidies. I think subsidies is nice, but I also have the view that most Western governments, they're not really that rich or with lots of spare capacity for free cash flows to give subsidies. Having said that, I think there is a strong role on the pricing side, on the just transition side, on the non-financial reporting, on regulations, multilateral banks, and central banks. And with this, I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much, and I pass the floor back to you, Alissa or Anastasia.
I do not hear you, Anastasia, or only in a very broken way, but I assume you are calling on me to take over.
Yes.
All right, good. So let me just share here. I'll try to be brief because I think we are sort of approaching our time limit here pretty fast. Everybody is excited to talk about this topic. So am I. So thanks for giving me a chance to have a few comments on this paper that was presented, and of course the related work by Patrick and Alissa, as well as with Adrian. So the summary, I don't think I need to do. Everybody is pretty clear. I do want to emphasize, I think Alissa didn't really emphasize it as much as it is clear in the paper to me. The paper does talk a lot about the why this climate finance at the required scale is not yet happening. And so this paper talks about 3 elements. I'm going to have a few other thoughts on what you might explore. So my discussion here is relatively closely tied to the paper itself. I do want to start off with sort of a broader thing. So yes, this is a very thought-provoking analysis. For me, it's kind of helpful maybe to tie it back to my old environmental economics training and sort of thinking about what is sustainability and how do we think about this. So in general, when you think about how decisions should be taken in society, the gold standard is you do a Pareto improvement. You make everybody better off, but that very rarely exists. So for a very long time, going back to Calder and Hicks, we've sort of agreed in society, our predecessors have agreed that it's potential Pareto improvements that we should be interested in. And so in sustainability, it's kind of similar, right? So one definition that we had in our paper, which had its 20-year anniversary last year, is that sustainability is dynamic efficiency plus intergenerational equity. The traditional way of thinking about sustainability was, well, you want to, keep the future generations at least as happy as the comparison, But of course, that's not a good criterion, because it's basically saying you can have subsistence level economics and you still are going to be sustainable. You do need non-wastefulness as well. But if we require actual efficiency and actual intergenerational equity, it's very difficult to achieve this goal of sustainability. So what we had proposed at that time was to think of the equivalent to the Calder-Hicks criterion as potential sustainability. So that sounds awfully abstract. My point is that this paper is actually, and the whole work that surrounds it, is actually very much in a very good tradition of public policy, of making decisions based not on does everybody gain, but do we make the pie larger? And so this may be a sort of trivial point to make, but I do think it may be worth pitching it also that way, that here you're not saying anything that's sort of totally outrageous and special. The numbers are outrageously large, and it's special because it's existential, but the basic idea of doing something which enlarges the pie overall is very much in line with how we think about economics. So I think that's a strong point here. A minor discomfort I have is that in this paper, but also in your other work, at least in the primary approach, there's only point estimates. And yeah, I can go to your super useful website. You didn't even advertise that, but it's a great website to play around with. But in the end, it's always point estimates. I personally would prefer to see a distribution of results. And that requires, of course, simulation, because many things are moving at the same time. The uncertainty is probably speaking in favor of more action, Weizmann type logic, but it's not a foregone conclusion. So I think it may be worth exploring that. I thought a little bit about what else you could write on. I mean, I know this policy brief, it's very well done, it's very clean, but if one thinks about what else might be going wrong. One thing that Franklin touched on a little bit, I think, or at least it was a related point, was what you might call incommensurability. So yeah, we can compensate people who are out of a job when we close down the coal plant, but a job is more than the money that's being paid for it. Of course, working at a coal mine really isn't fun at all to anybody, I assume, but there is a whole lifestyle sort of embedded in the way certain economies run. And so it's not just money that is going to play a role, I think. I'm gonna leave this out here just for time reasons. You advance the hypothesis, or at least in one sentence on one page, you say that there may be a lack of understanding on behalf of advanced country governments. I would think, testing this by either running surveys or also getting into the continuing education mode here may be really something we should be doing, or you should be considering doing. Finally, just to keep a few minutes for general discussion at least, I think you could link a bit more to the basic framework of political economy, that at least on single peaked preferences, it's the median voter who's going to be decisive. It will be interesting to understand whether preferences here are indeed single peaked or not. It's not obvious. The very final point is that conceivably, if the problem is more on the local side, right? Maybe changing the economies maybe have an advantage if you get a lump transfer, but there are co-benefits of addressing climate change, and in particular, the linkage from advancing temperatures to loss of biodiversity seems to be pretty clear. And the biodiversity, of course, that's a little bit my own Kool-Aid here, because I work on biodiversity a lot these days. The retaining biodiversity in the local level is another benefit that would come from to the countries that are asked to change their production, basically, in the long run, if we sustain climate change at a lower level, so to speak. So that could be maybe brought in as an additional argument that would have a less abstract geopolitical, we're gonna reach a 2-degree global warming goal, but a much more localized, immediate, tangible benefit to the local community. I think that's very important in political economy conversations. Sorry for being so brief. My voice is giving up anyways. Thank you for producing this great work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. Let's quickly ask Patrick, would you like to, Alissa had her chance to respond to one of the discussants, but maybe Patrick, you would like to respond so we can have a few minutes for questions from the audience.
Thank you. I just want to thank everyone. Very quick response to the corruption issue. The corruption issue is real, and this is why you want MDBs to play a critical role, because they are very effective at controlling corruption. That's all I want to say, and I'm really sorry I have to drop off at the half hour.
Thank you. Is there a time for the remaining discussants for one or two questions? I just wanted to ask Alex, what do you think the role of commercial banks in emerging markets could be in facilitating climate finance at scale?
So I'm speculating here. I think they can play an important role. So my analogy would start, what do we know about banks in general and their financing behavior? I mean, there's specialization. So in the sense of some banks actually specialize in green lending, some banks actually now specialize in lending to carbon intensive industries. That has long been the case, but it's been sort of accentuated. And so I think we can't expect local commercial banks to all hop on sort of a green bandwagon, but we can expect some of them to discover that this may be an excellent business opportunity. I think there's a very long-term play, although it's an urgent issue in terms of educating and winning over the managers, because one of the main reasons for why traditional large banks in Europe and in the US have continued to lend to carbon-intensive industries is because top management is maybe from a different generation. They may not be as attuned to the topics of the day, so to speak. So I think there's an opportunity to get the commercial banks playing a very active role, but they have to be well informed both on the top management, the board decision, and the concrete lending standards that are being set here, so that it's not just sort of a greenwashing on the banking side. Oh, we are doing a little bit there, but it's actually going to be impactful. That's what I would have to say on this. And I do have to excuse myself also. I have a 5:30 other commitment.
Thank you so much, Alex. I really appreciate your feedback. So
let's go one last question, which is, this is what is being discussed usually. And I think, Franklin probably could answer this one. One question is, some emerging markets are still behind their industrialization goals targets. How can this government align their industrialization path to more renewable energy driven than fossil fuel driven?
So I think that the key point there is that we're now at a point where solar cells and to some extent wind turbines are cheaper than fossil fuels, and there's a rapid development on those fronts. So I think that in the long run, there is potential for these countries to get rid of fossil fuels and have renewables from a pure economic standpoint. So I think in one of the slides that Alissa had, she talked about the high cost of capital makes green infrastructure investment in MDs, emerging market and developing economies, not feasible. But as the cost comes down, even if there's a high cost of capital, then it's going to be worth them not building coal-fired power plants, but building equivalent renewable ones. So, I think that is the long-run hope. Those, especially solar cells, the costs are coming down so quickly that these are going to be very commercially viable. And then we don't have to get into all these issues about the developing world, the developed world subsidizing the emerging markets and developing economies. I think ultimately that's our best hope because of this massive drop in the cost of the renewables.
I mean, as Alex said, this is a very interesting issue, so there was a lot to be said, but Alissa, you want to close the webinar?
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to really thank everyone for listening in, and I want to thank the discussants. So thank you so much. Maybe just, building on the point that Franklin makes, I think we're at a fork in the road where we have a choice, right? Either we're not going to act at scale right now, and we will go down the path of towards 3.1 degrees of warming, or we are going to invest at scale right now, for example, in climate finance, which will indeed, through these learning by doing curves, drive down the cost of renewables substantially, plus batteries, which are already being competitive with fossil fuels in many countries in the world. So that actually beyond 2030 or 2035, we don't even need intervention anymore. So I think the hopeful message is that we probably don't need climate finance till 2050. If we can do one big push now, we will more or less, I think, have won the climate war, even with higher cost of capital in EMDEs. And maybe just one response to what Nuno said. He said there's this difference of flow and stock. And I guess what we're saying is, yes, the stock is such that the rich countries are historically responsible for most of the emissions, even if they're no longer today. So they indeed have a moral obligation to pay, but that typically is not enough to move trillions. So we are over and beyond saying there is an economic case for them to do so, and hopefully we can overcome the corruption and the politics problems that Franklin has alluded to. But there is a lot at stake, right? And I hope we can gather the political will and see the economic imbalance between acting and non-acting and the difference in cost to do what it takes right now to safeguard not just this generations, but the generations to come on this earth. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Franklin, Nuno, and Alissa. This was an incredibly interesting webinar with a lot of wonderful ideas that hopefully will be taken up and we can make a bigger difference in the future. And thank you very much for the audience. Apologies if we didn't manage to answer all your questions, but we have run out of time. So thank you very much all. Bye-bye.